Previously in this library mini-series, we learned that working around a historic building can include accommodations like adding drop ceilings to make room for cables, or leaving exposed walls and roof tiles to be seen within the new addition to respect the original architecture. You're listening to What's the Scope with Finegold Alexander Architects, the podcast where we share our hands-on approach to projects and how we love to celebrate design that is boundless. I'm your host, Madison Mercado, a marketing coordinator at the firm, and today we're sharing the fourth and final episode in our library design series. I'm sitting down with the firm's director of design today, and we'll be discussing the design approach and creative measures we have to take with the historic buildings that most of our library projects encompass.
My name is Tony Hsiao. I'm a principal of director of design at Finegold Alexander, and I've had the privilege of being involved with, among many other projects, libraries. And I've probably been involved with over a dozen libraries over the past 3 decades or so while I've been in the organization. And I think one of the things that really has drawn me to this kind of project is it's one of the few institutions that is truly democratic. It serves the community at large. It is essentially free, and it is the wealth of knowledge that one gains. I even remember as a child growing up, I loved going to libraries. I think it was one of my favorite things to do, and just the ability to be exposed to so many different things and ideas and stories and learning and just expanding one's world, I think is one of the best things that libraries do. I also think that one of the things that in my working on this design side of libraries is just how much libraries have also changed as times and society has changed. So in the early stages, libraries were much more about the collections and trying to organize ways for people to get at their different collections, whether there's children's or teens or adults, but in generally that was the bulk of what libraries did. And of course, books and the printed page was the primary way that libraries functioned, and so therefore it became an ingathering of that and disseminating collections to the public at large. Nowadays, libraries are much more essentially community centers and community hubs. They function not only for people to come together for acquiring knowledge and being exposed to material, but it's a social gathering place. People also meet at the libraries to come together. They now have components that are involved with food. They also have areas where they have meetings. They have storytelling. They also have libraries no longer do you have to be quiet. In fact, they want much more engagement, and they serve many, many more things in the service of communities. And I think it's part of society needs libraries, I think, more than ever. I think in today's world, unfortunately, with the challenges that we face with knowledge, information, and also accuracy of information, libraries are one of the few repositories of where you can really get that. And I think it's one of those elements and the projects that we have in our communities that services folks. So I think people go to libraries to really seek out help. Sometimes they're also doing things that also bridge other aspects in their lives beyond just reading. And I think we have to design libraries that function much more to service a wider range of communities in terms of what they want, the age groups they serve, and the diversity of the population that are often represented in the communities they're in.
Right. Yeah, a couple of days ago when I was recording with Ellen and Josephine, we were talking about how libraries are basically the only place in town that serve everybody, like someone age 0 to 100, basically. So it's always a good building to have in your town, and it's interesting that you and so many other people at this firm have developed such a liking toward designing them and a desire to keep doing even more. So for the rest of this segment, I kind of want to talk more specifically about the design approach that we take here at Finegold Alexander. In the previous episodes, we kind of talked more about the programming and that type of part, or that part of what goes into a library. But I want to talk more about how you choose the materials for a library, how you decide on the shape of the building, and the aesthetics, if you will, of what goes into that approach when you're working with the community, working with, even just amongst the architects at the firm. So I wanted to start with asking about how you approach the actual design of the building when it comes to tailoring for everyone, like we said, a library usually does.
It's a really great question. So the design of libraries, I think, goes on multiple tracks. So yes, we start with the program and the understanding of what is in that community's library. What is it that they want to have in there? And in particular, what's important of how the library serves the community. And by that, it means also the relationship of the different programs. So for example, if they say, we want the children's library to be front and center and it needs to be the heart of the library, then you start off with the principles. We almost call these guiding principles from the community standpoint and the library staff and directors, which is they have a much greater sense of what is going to work for their community. So from that, we use that as a jumping off point to not only create the program, which tells you how many of the spaces, what's the size, what's the count, what's the seat, what's the collection, all of the data, the quantitative data we need, but it's the qualitative aspects that is really the glue that's going to eventually hold it together. And also, finally, we also really want to understand what is the community about? Why is this library appropriate to that community versus a different community? What is special about that community that informs the design? And then a different side of this is we're in this firm often tasked with doing libraries that not only are sometimes ground up, but they're often additions or expansions to existing libraries. Right. So that's another really interesting challenge because we've often said the idea that the building is the silent partner because the building tells you a story. And when it tells you a story, it also tells you what it wants to be and also what it doesn't want to be. And so we are very cognizant based on our experience of working with existing buildings of how, when one does an expansion or addition, what's really going to be appropriate, but also what works. Because we definitely don't want things that like, this doesn't really work. You wanted to create a design, but it's not tying to the old building, and it's making it much more difficult to lay it out. So one of the things we try to get at also is how does the building, if there's an existing building, inform the design? So if you do a transformation, renovation, expansion, all of that has to be part of it, and the buildings have to talk to one another. So I think that's another issue from a design standpoint, is that dialogue between the old and the new and how you marry the two together. And these things are very critical, I would say, in the experience that we've had doing a lot of our library work. So it starts with the program, it starts with the conversations, of course, with the staff and the community and the key stakeholders, but then it also starts with an understanding of the site, understanding what the opportunities and limitations are, and then we go from there.
Mm-hmm. And when you're deciding what the addition is going to look like onto that usually historic building, what's the approach that you take to decide what matches? So like if it had a red brick building originally, do you automatically go for red brick on the addition?
Yeah, so I think a lot of things that we also always try to do is we create several options that we share with the client, and we never go with just one idea and one approach. We always probe at this because we're going to go at this with the idea that we need to explore different ideas. We also want to share with the client different thought patterns, and some of them may not always be what one expects from the start. So we might have a sense, or the client might have a sense, well, I know it's going to be red brick because that's always what we've done in the town, and every building we have here is that because our building is red brick. Mm-hmm. And we understand that, and we certainly appreciate that, but we also want to test out things that says, well, what happens if it isn't red brick? Where does that lead you to? Is this something that you would be open to, or no, that clearly is a non-starter? And then furthermore, we always design with the intention that we never want to mimicry an existing historic building. Not only do we not feel that is the right approach, but honestly, especially if you deal with historical standards, you actually need the addition to be of its time and to also be understood that this is clearly of its time. It's not just trying to copy or imitate something that had existed in the past, because it's a completely different scale. It can be programmed. So I think that thread and the execution of that's where the design really, I think, is a key component about what we do as a project. And frankly, as architects, that is what we love to do, because that challenge of figuring out not only how to solve their problem, but how is this design going to manifest itself in terms of what it looks like, how is it mass, how does it relate to the community, the neighborhood, the street, and ultimately how is this going to be received by the greater community at large in terms of having people really say with pride saying that's our new library, or this is what we did to expand it. Isn't this great? So I think for us, we have a saying that, at the end of the day, when buildings leave our firm, it is the owners take possession of it. It's like when the carpet is worn and the building is being used, and we feel like we've accomplished our job because that means the building is being used. And it's being used, and it's actively being engaged, and it's achieving things that the client hopefully set out and we hopefully achieve for them.
Right. Yeah, and that's always good to know, like when people probably come up to you afterwards and be like, we really enjoy the design that you did and it helps us build a better community. I was thinking about the rendering for the Jones Library in Amherst, and how the addition part does match the historic building, but it looks different. You can tell that, it kind of has the same colors, so they blend together. But it's obviously not the same, like, stone, or I'm not sure, that the historic building was. And I was wondering about how you decide on that approach versus, I'm thinking about a different library like J.B. Fletcher, where at Holyoke Library, where the addition part does look a lot more different than the historic building.
Yeah.
You can tell that there is like this glass box basically that's attached, and I was wondering about how you approach deciding whether or not you want to build something that is more starkly different versus something that matches a little bit.
I think a lot of the design, honestly, really comes from the inside out. I think we don't go there with the preconception like, well, we're going to create a modern-looking building right off the top, and it wants to be this and this and this and this. So the examples that you cite from amongst the 3 or 4 recent libraries we've done, all of them are very different. The approach that we took is very different. And the way that these libraries are turning out and how they're going to ultimately look like is very different. But what threads through all of them in common, again, it goes back to that particular community. Those communities are driving the discussion about what they feel is appropriate to their servicing them. I will also say that, for example, at Holyoke, we did have latitude, and we thought more carefully about the addition, wanting to be clearly new, and as you said, much more kind of modern and transparent. But the clues on terms of the scale, the massing, all that was, we feel, very compatible. We did choose materials that blended, we thought, well. The existing building was stone, the new library was more brick and glass, but the scale and the size of it, we did not want to overwhelm the existing historic library. So it became a kind of book match end, which was one side was more contemporary, the other side was historic, but we blended the two together. Another library, which we did at Jones, that was a different kind of challenge because the library that existed is much smaller than the addition. The addition is like 3 times the size of the existing library. So in that case, it became more of how do we mask the expansion so it doesn't overwhelm the historic. So the existing is still front and center. It's the primary way into the library. It still serves as the touchstone for that community. Everyone recognizes the importance of that library. But once you move through the existing library into the new, much larger expansion, we did things that tried to mitigate the scale. So we broke down the massing, so it wasn't just one big, large form. We tried to get some clues from the shaping of the massing that also was informed by the historic library. And then we chose materials that we did feel was compatible with the existing stone and brick and siding that was on that library. So we threaded through that so it looked like, well, it was clearly new, but it felt compatible. So I think we had to do some careful massaging, both in terms of massing to help, in some ways, scale it down so it didn't overwhelm, while at the same time recognizing that we were creating a much more modern addition to the existing library. And then another one, which I think was for me personally very interesting, completely different, was when we designed the Christy McAuliffe Library in Framingham. So here, we didn't have an existing building. It was a very kind of nondescript site next to a half shopping mall. But what inspired us there was actually Christy McAuliffe, and having a chance to also learn about her, talking to her family. And they wanted a library that was going to represent the spirit of Christy McAuliffe, which was somebody who, unfortunately, of course, died in a very tragic accident. But she always aspired and reached for the stars and was trying to be somebody who was very forward-looking. So we wanted to come up with a design that was going to honor that spirit of her. So I think we came up with what we believe is a very contemporary design, but something that also was something that in a way became a little bit of a local landmark to the community. It was not something typically seen in that part of Framingham at all. So I think when people saw the design, we first thought, how is this going to be received? But in the end, they loved it. And in part, I was inspired by the spirit of what this library represented, who it was named after. So everyone fully embraced this idea, yes, like go for it. We really should design something that speaks to the spirit of the library that Teresa McAuliffe, I think, would feel at home in, were she alive today, or be inspired by her own personal story. So we find the stories are just as important, I think, to underpin design. And I feel like the storytelling about how a building is shaped and designed is really critical. So when we say it's guiding principle, when we say guiding principle, behind that guiding principle is how do you narrate why the building is the way it is? Why is this library the way it looks? You know, if you could sum up what is being expressed here in the way we designed it, I think that's the really important thing. And I think the more we have clarity about that and understand that, and the more legible it is, I think the stronger the ultimate end result is and how the building itself is created and what it looks like.
Right. And it's a beautiful building. I haven't been over to that part of Framingham yet, but I do want to go check it out because it's a lot different than I feel like some of the other projects are at this firm.
Yeah.
And kind of thinking about that, I was wondering if you thought that our library projects all have a style that's like distinctly quote unquote Finegold Alexander. You know, something that is like a through line through all the projects, even though, as you said, they do have a completely different approach depending on the story behind the building, the community, and whatever their needs are.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I wouldn't say that there is a particular style that's associated with our firm in terms of like, if you point to some architect's work, you say, oh, that's clearly a so-and-so building, right? That you just identified right away that's a signature look or signature design approach. So I don't think that is typically what we do. I do think what I think really works well for this firm, and I think what is in some ways really playing to our strengths, is that we're very thoughtful on doing these kind of very interesting and often very complex projects. And I think we pay a lot of attention to design. I think we are constantly trying to challenge ourselves, like, you know, in the end of the day, is this the best we can do? The other big part of that that's entered into the equation, of course, is sustainability. So that's informing a lot of where we're going, and certainly going forward, this is really, really important. So I would say that what, to me, represents a project that comes out of this office is like every project, I think we believe we're very thoughtful in terms of how a particular library is really manifesting the spirit of that community. And some of them might push the envelope, no pun intended, a little bit. It may be like, okay, that's not what we expected we would see here, but we really like it. And I think you captured a different essence or a different side of us that we didn't realize we had. So sometimes that comes about through dialogue and through design and iterative process. You know, I always believe that it's really good to sort of test the boundaries, like even if it goes outside the client's comfort zone in terms of what they might think that they want to have, it's really good to find out, because you sometimes are going to be surprised, like, oh, we never thought we would get there, but you know, this is actually a really good way of thinking about it. And I think we feel like the more we can have that conversation in terms of how we design with them and the willingness to have the dialogue about design, I think ultimately the better the whole end result is. So we both push on our clients and clients push on us. So I think that give and take, that kind of almost, I would say, creative tension, as it were, I think that's really part of what, as architects, is what we are really trained to do as problem solvers. So we not only are here to solve their problems and their needs and all of that, but ultimately we want to create as good a design, as good as a project as we possibly can. That again goes back to like saying, yeah, that you really served us well, or you got us, or this really helped us to reimagine how we could be on the site. And another one that just comes to mind, is when we did the expansion for the mid-century library that edition for that library was a completely different take on it. And when we ended up doing that, and the name will come back to me in a second, sorry, we had to really think carefully about that library itself. So sometimes we're also coming in at projects where we're not even the original architects that started with it, but because of other reasons, they decided to go a different way. And then we're often brought into some projects where there already was another design, and we had to kind of reimagine it or rethink it. So we've had that situation too occur.
Right. And I imagine you love the challenge and the challenge of working with all of these libraries, especially because the firm does so many ad renos. There is a lot more thinking that has to go into it versus something that's like ground up on a flat.
Yeah, and honestly, I think, Madison, one of the things, at least for me personally, and I've told my colleagues this, sometimes, without thinking about it, out of the blue, something will suddenly pop up in me. And I've had situations I really wake up in the middle of the night, and I just grab a piece of paper and sketch something down because I'm like, wait a minute, there's a spark of an idea here. Mm-hmm. The client has posed a problem to us. There's a challenge where we have to figure this out because clearly they're identifying an issue. And then when they present a problem, suddenly you're like, okay, how do I think about this differently? Mm-hmm. Maybe I'm not thinking about this the right way, or maybe I'm not thinking about this the way that, or we're not thinking about this the way that we normally should be thinking about it. So like, let's push the envelope, let's flip the thing on its end and go at it differently. Because sometimes when you get stuck and all architects at some point, they can lock into something, but then they say, it's not quite solving everything. This is still not there yet. So like, well, think outside the box, as it were, go at it differently. And sometimes that spark of that challenge or that problem leads to something very different or something that nobody had thought of before. Simply because they've identified, or someone's identified a key issue that, okay, we need to solve this. This is not there yet. And then you come up with something and then you say, oh yeah, that's a really good idea. And when that comes about, I think for architects, I think one of the most rewarding aspects is when the kernel of ideas emerge and then eventually it becomes a foundation for a design is evolves, then I think that is very gratifying. And I will cite my former mentor and original Mo Finegold. He's always told me it's architecture, it's about ideas. So I think I took that to heart, meaning like you have to be able to see things even more than just only solving problems, because at the end of the day, as designers and people in the creative field, we also want to say, yeah, this is also the spark of the idea behind this design. Can you literally create an idea that says, this in essence is what this project is about? And if you can do that as a kind of generative concept, a generative idea, then I think that resides in the power of the project. And ultimately, when we come to that idea, the spark of the idea that says this is the underpinning for everything that follows, then I think as designers, we like to say, how does this reinforce the idea? You go back to basic roots. Is this reinforcing the concept? Is this reinforcing the vision? And if it's not, then you need to discard it, because you want to come back to, ultimately, this is the way that's going to thread this thing through, and it's going to tie everything together. So when you look at the design, you look at the materials, you look at the colorway, you look at the expression, you look at the arrangement of spaces, it still comes back to, yeah, this is holding together, which is the other part. It's holding together as a whole, it's not parts, because now it resolves itself and it's synergistic. So this is, in the end of the day, what we also like to do, I'd say.
Right. It's all very interesting. That was also my last question. So I think that was a great sentiment to end on, especially knowing that this is something that, a thinking that you've kept with yourself for the last, however long that you've been at the firm now. And even when Mo was here, when you were working with him as well.
It's a legacy. And by the way, it just popped in my head. So Stone.
Oh,
Popular Life in Stone. I think what I was just trying to say about that was that simply that was a very interesting, different kind of approach, because the 1950s or 1960s mid-century modern library, which we had to add to. And I love the underpinnings of that building because it kind of led to a more modern solution there. But we also had to solve a very complicated challenge on the grade and level changes and addressing a critical aspect of that library. But again, the edition cued off of that 1950s edition, 1960s original. And I think we created a whole new face to the community. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think at the end of the day, all these libraries in the end, and I think for me personally, it's always the next project I look forward to. So you've done one and you want to do another one. And every time you do one, you learn from that one as you move forward to the next. So I think that's the evolution. And what I love about design is like there's always something new to learn.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, ideas are not formed in a vacuum. It's not one individual. It's very much a collaborative process, and it's a give and take of the dialogue that I think always to me spurs interest. Is like when people come up with something and they react and I'll say, that's a really good idea. I'm glad you brought that to our attention. So I always think that the power of more minds in tackling a project or tackling a problem is better. It's not I don't believe in the classic old school one visionary designs everything, because that's frankly not real. Even in the firms that are led by whatever you might call star architects, it's a whole team of people behind it. All are equally committed. So we have to recognize that it's a team effort and it's a collaborative approach. So I don't want to at all downplay that. And I think that is what this firm is really about. And it's not just lip service, but I think we really, really believe in that. And as I said, we always believe good ideas can come from anywhere, and we want to recognize that.
Thank you for listening to What's the Scope with Finegold Alexander Architects. This episode was produced and edited by Madison Mercado with music from the YouTube Music Library. Find us at faainc.com and connect with us on LinkedIn and Instagram at Finegold Alexander Architects to find out when the next series drops. See you next time.